This is Tony Christ. Welcome. Today we have some interesting topics to cover, so I'm going to get right on it right now. First, I'd like to welcome a number of BRIC countries to this podcast, and I'd like to welcome them with a caution. And this will be discussed at length next week. But I want to raise the point right now. Iran is on the verge of getting a nuclear warhead. North Korea, Russia, and China are BRIC countries, even though North Korea isn't technically a BRIC, I'll call it a BRIC, that have nuclear weapons and have learned how to coexist with nuclear weapons. I have severe questions about Iran, specifically due to their very primitive reliance on religion to control and their actions in the last 30 years. We're going to discuss that at some depth next week. I don't think it's in anyone's interest in the world, including America, including Israel, including Russia, including China, including North Korea, for Iran to have intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear tips on them, with their actions and their history. In any case, we're not talking about that today. We're going to talk about hormonal imbalances. We're going to talk about changes in America. We're going to talk also for the BRIC countries out there in a more closed social system. We're going to discuss the effects of hormones on societal mores and the inhibitions that hormones may present in a closed environment to inhibit positive things, as well as what the state the state being the federal government or the government in a closed system, as well as a more open system, how in fact indirectly governments may inhibit positive behaviors as well as negative behaviors, which is their intent. So let's get into it. In America, we're undergoing a transition couched in our society of basic freedoms, freedom of speech, which I'm enjoying today in doing this podcast. I don't think President Xi would allow me to do it in China. I don't think President Putin would allow me to do it. And I'm not so certain one way or another about North Korea, whether I'd be allowed or not. He may go ahead and allow it. In any case, the fact that social mores, beliefs, may not be codified in laws, but they're cultural, and they tend to determine behaviors. And I view them like guardrails. Many are presented by religions in the world or philosophies which act in effect like religions, in particular communism, which acts like a religion. In any case, they present guardrails, behaviors that are acceptable and not acceptable for us to abide by. And they pretty much guide our lives. Now, in America, where you have decentralization, even though that is changing in America fairly rapidly, compared to the BRICS, we have a decentralized system, a relatively free system, but we've, in the last 70 years, seen a transition of these social mores and an attack on many of them that were Judeo-Christian in their origins. And we've seen a transition from the governance or oversight of these mores on a family level, where a mom and dad were governing and administering, to a national or state level. We've seen that transition occur, and it's occurred in the context of a fairly open country, a very rich country, by material measures, which really almost have zero poverty in America, and has developed a number of problems in the last 70 years. And I want to get into discussing them, but I also want to make points along the way of how these same hormonal changes are manifest in closed systems, for example, China or Russia, because I think it would be positive for all of us to get on the same page with this. So basically, in the 1950s in America, the mom and the dad were the most powerful political unit in America. They were more powerful than the state governments and more powerful than the federal government. And that began to change dramatically in 1965 with the advent of welfare. Well, here we are. Let's fast forward to the 2020s. Okay, we've had a number of changes along the way. And in the 2020s, we've seen a series of tribal demonstrations. In 2020, after George Floyd, they turned into very violent demonstrations. 25 individuals died. Over $2 billion in property damages were incurred. And the state acquiesced. The Department of Justice did nothing. and these were in multiple cities. And I might add that state governments had various reactions, but they were all very much on the wimpish side too. At that time in 2020, there was a national election, and the powers in force were trying to get Joe Biden elected, frankly, and I think this is part of the explanation. And they didn't want to rile up prospective voters. And I think we're undergoing the same thing now, as opposed to the death at that time of a Black drug user. Today, the emotion has shifted to Palestine, and the demonstrations, though, are just as almost violent and nonsensical as the original ones were. Now, I want to discuss this in the context of what's happening in America and how hormones have changed and are having an influence on America in general. In order to do that, we'll have to go back again to last century. I want to use gambling as a guide to this discussion. In the 1970s in America, state governments in America, to raise revenues, started selling lottery tickets. And I must admit the odds were a lot worse than if you were gambling with an illegal bookie. But in any case, I noticed them in 7-Elevens. I noticed the tickets on the floors. I noticed working men weren't buying bread and milk. They were spending their money on lottery tickets, trying to strike it rich. But more than that, it had two effects, one immediate and the other longer term. The immediate effect was it took people's attention off what government did with the money. In America, up till that time, there was accountability, so that when a region, a locality, a state spent money, it would have to put it on the ballot and ask for permission from us, the payers. That was not the case after the lottery started. The funds went into general funds, and nobody really monitored, although politicians periodically say, oh, well, we're spending them on schools, or we're doing this or that with them. Nobody really monitored the money. Okay, so that was an immediate change that the lotteries brought, a wealth of riches into state coffers that were unmonitored. So nobody really knew what they were spending them on. And then the second change, which is more profound and longer term, the government, in sanctioning gambling, started to change the cultural mores and the cultural inhibition or restriction we had against gambling, which was also a legal restriction in many, many states and communities, possibly with the exception of Las Vegas. So all of a sudden it became acceptable. Gambling was okay. Now let's look at gambling. When you gamble, it creates a level of stress initially. So you feel hormonally, you feel a little rush of adrenal rush. Subsequently, when the event is resolved, you feel a release of dopamine. Now, dopamine is the addictive hormone that people learn to release with all forms of addictions. And this covers the full gambit. It can cover certainly covers all drugs. It can cover anorexia, where a person is depriving themselves of food, killing themselves, but the anxiety they feel is mitigated by the release of dopamine, which is a good feeling. So in order to obtain that, quote, good feeling, they're actually killing themselves. And it's also illustrated in numerous drug addictions and alcohol addictions and almost in sexual addictions, although sexual addictions are hard to figure out how you're killing yourself. But the point is, when the behavior becomes compulsive and repetitive and out of control, it is always due to the release of dopamine. Now, you see it culturally in these ritualistic demonstrations that are popping up all over against Palestine. You see groups of students that have abrogated traditional social mores and have gone to extremes to demonstrate. You saw it also in 2020 with the riots that preceded the 2020 presidential elections. You're almost getting into the same fervor before the 2024 elections. And Department of Justice has been totally absent, incidentally, in both these cases. I've written a paper I'm going to send out with this that will discuss this in more detail. But when you have a closed social system, when you have a social system that responds dramatically to numerous things that the state feels are not in the interest of the state, it becomes somewhat muted. You still have the release of these hormones, but they're more internalized. You still have adrenal release, you still have dopamine formation, but they're more internalized and they're not vocalized, and they tend to inhibit people's productivity. Now, is there anything good with hormonal release? Well, cortisol is called the love hormone. And that is actually a good hormone and a productive hormone. And it's called the love hormone for a reason, because it's what a mother feels to a baby when a baby's born. It's what a father feels and releases for a newborn. And it doesn't even have to be your biological child. You can feel it for grandparents would feel it. So it's a connection between human beings. Now, this is a very, very important difference that everyone has to understand. Dopamine is released for a positive occurrence. It's a positive event, and it's between human beings. Dopamine, and I just said it backwards, dopamine is released on any event that is a repetitive behavior, whether it's positive or negative. Oxytocin is released only on a positive event. So we want people to experience the love hormone. We don't want our society to fall into an adrenal dopamine trap, because that could very easily lead to violence, and does often. As a matter of fact, the German Nazis used to give used to give amphetamines to their soldiers to create this same unrealistic pseudo anxiety that would trigger dopamine. So they almost were indestructible in combat. Very scary stuff, very crazy stuff. So we don't want to encourage behaviors that expand dopamine. Now, the other big thing in America that has been negative has been obesity. Now, there's a hormone released with stress called cortisol, which also releases sugar. And there's a direct correlation between people who are gaining weight and high cortisol levels, indicating they have high stress. And in America today, we have 45% of our population is obese. 45% is obese, experiencing cortisol levels. And these cortisol levels also are connected to dopamine releases. So when stress, be it adrenal caused stress or cortisol caused stress or both, are upon us, it's very easy to get into a behavior that will release dopamine into the system. And this is not a good behavior. It's not a productive behavior. In America today, these social mores, I call them guardrails, used to be historically administered by parents. Now, even in closed cultures, I call communist governments closed because of their central controls and their lack of liberty. Like, I couldn't do this podcast for you gentlemen if I was in one of your countries, more than likely. And those countries are, North Korea, China, Russia. But in a more open system, I can do it. But the yin and the yang of a more open system is when you don't have guardrails, or when you've intellectualized away your guardrails, which is where America is, it opens the door to unwanted behaviors that are destructive, not only unwanted, but destructive. And therein, you're going to find that culprit dopamine being released, be it in an addictive behavior or be it in any of a number of behaviors. Dopamine is the hormone that is going to reward a person for doing a negative or destructive act, which we don't want. Nobody wants. Not in a closed economy or an open economy. In America today, we have a number of changes that have occurred since transitioning power from the mom and the dad in the 1950s and 1960s to the central government. And the government has wrestled quite a bit of power away from the mom and the dad. And today, with all the stimulation in society, it again is tempting people to do non-productive endeavors that can be viewed as very destructive and are dopamine enhanced. Now, I don't want to go on with this too long, but I do think I would raise a caution for the closed economies that may be watching this video. And closed economy, I mean an economy in which your economics and your choices are not as fully determined by you individually, nor are the consequences, where much of the economics is centrally controlled. If it's not owned outright, it's controlled. For example, Nazi Germany. Another example, there are a huge amount of controls in Russia today. There are a huge amount of controls in China today, and very much surveillance. In North Korea, similarly, there are a huge amount of controls. There is a loss in that environment to not allowing individuals adequate freedom to express their talents and their abilities. And the inhibition, the social inhibition, actually inhibits that ability. In America, we've grown in a Judeo-Christian tradition where individuals are allowed to internalize the cost as well as the benefits of their actions. Now, that's the idea, and that's the way it was up to the 50s, but it's changing here dramatically. And the changes are not productive. Although there's still the illusion that that exists, and it does in some instances, the fact that there's a laxity, a laxness all the way to the top, a selective laxness in certain groups and certain people to any kind of guardrail, social guardrail, let alone law, presents a problem and invites abuse. And the abuses are seen very broadly in America with over a 45% obesity rate in a very wealthy country. That means these people are stressed. It's not that they're just eating and drinking and happy. It means they are feeling an abnormal amount of stress, independent of the fact that they have more wealth than anyone in the world. And that has to be resolved. And unfortunately, oftentimes in that environment, it's resolved by some compulsive activity that stimulates the emission of dopamine, which is a destructive hormone. It's not a positive hormone. I mean, it would have a use if you're being, attacked by a wild animal or something like that. To have an adrenal rush and a release might have a positive use, but it certainly as something that a human being can control and cause to be emitted daily, it's one of the most destructive things you can imagine. So on the one hand, in that closed economy, you're closing off the ability of that individual to create something that would have a positive influence on society because he's not bearing the cost and the benefit of his decision. You've taken that from him. So you're inhibiting that kind of positive development. But in an open society, you're running the risk of letting it run rampant. And right now, it's out of control. And it's going in directions that are very destructive and are going to have to be addressed and have to be resolved one day. Now, I don't want to go on and on. I've written a paper about it. I'm going to send you the paper too. I do want to take a closing moment in talking about Iran and my concerns with regards to Iran. Now I'm an old Greek, 75 years old, and I remember when Iran changed its name from the Persian Empire. Iran, President Putin, means Aryan. I have never seen a country that is more Nazi than Iran. I know you use the term repeatedly with respect to Ukraine. I'm sorry, Mr. President, I don't see it. I applaud once again President Xi's actions, and I hope you'll come around to listening to him to bring an end to that war and going to the negotiating table. It's doing no one any good. I so much feel sorry for the attack that occurred in Moscow and the innocents that were killed due to Muslim radicals. There's a level of Sharia law. We're going to talk about it more next week. And part of it, apostasy, which is being enforced by 7 countries, not all Muslim countries by any means, not India, not Pakistan, not a number of Muslim countries, but being enforced by 6 countries. And it basically means if you don't believe in Muhammad, you die. It's being advocated by Iran. It has been consistently for a long time. And it's concerning to me that they're on the precipice of getting nuclear weapons. We're going to discuss it next week. I want you all to have a blessed week. I look forward to next week, so I'm going to prepare for it and write a paper on it. And I want you to consider the hormonal changes that have occurred in America. And also, if you're in another country, to look around and start to view it through that lens. And if you're in a closed economy country, you want to unleash the love hormone. You want to unleash the abilities of people by granting them more individual freedoms. If you're in a world that's in the middle in turmoil right now, you can understand the release of dopamine and the destructive ability it has. So have a blessed day. I've enjoyed talking to you. This is Tony Christ. I'm in Falls Church, Virginia, where I've been all my life. And I look forward to talking to you next week. And we'll get on with discussing the situation in Iran. Thank you so much.